Chapter 71 The Shadow of the Wall. For turns of the moon had passed since the flames of the Greyjoy rebellion had been extinguished in the Sunset Sea. The harsh, biting winds of the north had begun to carry the heavy, distinct scent of deep winter, freezing the mud of the King's Road into solid ruts and dusting the high towers of Winterfell in a permanent coat of white. Yet, despite the encroaching cold, the lands of House Stark were thrumming with a relentless, driving heat. The thousands of thralls and salt wives emancipated from the Iron Islands had not simply been dumped into the snow to fend for themselves. Under Eddard Stark's unyielding command, they had been woven into the very fabric of the northern rebuilding. Ned walked through the newly constructed district of the Winter City, a heavy cloak of Shadowcat fur pulled tight around his broad shoulders. Beside him walked Lady Ashera, her breath misting in the freezing air, her dark hair tucked beneath a hood of rich purple wool. Her hand rested gently over her lower belly. She was 3 moons pregnant with their next child, a quiet, fiercely guarded joy that shielded her from the biting wind. This district of the city had been named the Hearthward Quarter. It was a sprawling maze of sturdy, single-story dwellings built from the stark stone Ned had introduced. The houses were not grand, but they were infinitely superior to the damp, miserable hovels of the Iron Islands. They were dry, sealed against the wind, and heated by cleverly built, narrow hearths that burned the clean coal from the Karstark mines. "They are settling well," Ashera noted, her violet eyes scanning the busy street. Men and women who had spent years, sometimes decades, under the brutal whip of the Ironborn were moving with a newfound, tentative dignity. They wore thick, undyed wool provided by the castle stores. There was still a lingering wariness in their eyes, the deeply ingrained reflex of the abused. But there were no chains, and no overseers shouting curses. "They have purpose," Ned replied smoothly, acknowledging a low, respectful bow from a passing man carrying a basket of turnips. A man who works for his own hearth and his own bread does not need a whip to motivate him. He only needs the promise that the bread will not be stolen. They stopped before a long, wide building where the rhythmic clacking of wooden looms echoed into the street. A woman emerged from the doorway, her hands dusted with colorful dye. It was Miri, the Associ woman they had met moons ago when the stone was first being poured. She looked significantly healthier now, the hollows of her cheeks filled out by steady rations, her olive skin free of new bruises. "Lord Stark, Lady Ashera." Miri greeted them, offering a deep, graceful curtsy that hinted at a highborn past long before the Reavers had taken her. Ashera smiled genuinely. "The Weaver's Hall sounds remarkably busy this morning, Miri." "The Giant's Fleece, my lady," Miri said, her eyes shining with pride. "The wool Lord Umber sends from the last hearth is extraordinary. Thick as bear fur, but it combs out as soft as the finest Myrish silk. We are spinning it into heavy winter cloaks and undertunics. The merchants from White Harbor cannot load their carts fast enough. Ensure that your own people are clothed first," Ned instructed, his voice carrying the calm authority of the warden. "No man or woman in the Hearthward Quarter is to freeze this winter. Once the district is fully supplied, the excess goes to the trade caravans. Are the wages fair?" "More than fair, my lord," Miri said, a profound gratitude softening her voice. "For the first time in 10 years, I hold silver in my own hands. We are free, Lord Stark. Truly free." Ned offered a solemn nod. "You earned your freedom by surviving. Now you earn your future by building. If you require more looms or raw dyes from the south, speak to the castle stewards. They have my seal." As they walked away from the Weaver's Hall, Ashera slipped her arm through Ned's, pressing close against his side for warmth. "You have given them back their humanity, Ned," she murmured. "It is a beautiful thing to witness." "It is a practical thing," Ned corrected gently, though he squeezed her arm in affection. "The North has always lacked hands. We had the space, we had the resources, but we did not have the people to work them. The Ironborn, in their arrogance, gathered the finest craftsmen, farmers, and laborers from across the known world and kept them concentrated on a few miserable rocks. I merely returned the pieces to where they belong on the board." Ashera let out a musical, breathy laugh. "Only you could look at an act of compassion and describe it as moving pieces on a board. The old gods judge the results, Ashera, not the poetry of the act," Ned said, a faint smirk touching his lips. "But I will accept the compliment nonetheless." The warmth of the Lord Solar was a stark contrast to the biting wind of the city. A massive fire roared in the hearth, illuminating the large map table that dominated the center of the room. Ned stood over it, studying the painted wooden markers that represented the various holdfasts and troop movements across the vast expanse of his kingdom. Maester Luwin stood opposite him, a stack of freshly unsealed parchment scrolls resting in the crook of his arm. The maester looked weary, the relentless pace of Winterfell's administration demanding much of the older man. The reports from the coast are excellent, my lord. Luwin began, reading from the top scroll. Lord Benjen writes from Sea Dragon Point. The shipyards are operating in full force. The Western Fleet has resumed its patrols of the Sunset Sea. There has not been a single sighting of a longship since the surrender at Pike. Balon is licking his wounds, Ned stated without looking up from the map. He is counting the 50 fishing smacks Robert allowed him and weeping into the salt. The West is secure for a generation. What of the East? Lord Manderley reports immense coin, my lord, Luwin said, shifting to the next parchment. The winter glass, the distilled spirits, and the new soft wool are commanding a king's ransom in bravos and pentos. The silver flows steadily up the white knife. Good. Ensure the surplus coin is heavily invested in grain stores from the Reach while the sea lanes remain open. We do not know how deep this winter will bite. It shall be done, Luwin nodded, making a notation on a slate. Then his face grew grave. He unrolled the final 3 scrolls. However, the news from the far north is troubling. Ned's gaze snapped up from the map, his gray eyes locking onto the maester. The wall. The wall stands firm, Lord Commander Corgyle assures us, Luwin corrected quickly. The supplies you have sent have greatly lifted the spirits of the Black Brothers. But the lands immediately south of it, the new gift, the reports are alarming. Luwin stepped forward, pointing to the strip of land just below the massive ice structure. Lord Umber and the mountain clans you settled in the gift report a significant, undeniable increase in wildling activity. Wildlings groups crossing the borders with alarming frequency to steal cattle and sheep. Ned frowned, his brow furrowing deeply. He moved a few small, unpainted wooden markers to the northernmost edge of the map. How frequent? Ned asked, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. Twice or thrice a half moon, Luwin read, his eyes scanning the Gretchen's notoriously large, messy handwriting. Lord Umber reports that his outriders are exhausted from chasing down dozens of separate, fractured raiding parties. They strike quickly at the newly established farms near the edge of the haunted forest, steal whatever cattle and sheep they can drive, and scatter back into the trees. They do not stay to fight if they can help it, but when cornered, they fight with a wild frenzy. And the Littles? Ned prompted. The Little clan reports similar incursions in the high passes, Luwin confirmed. Small bands, stealing cattle and fleeing back into the frost before they can be caught. The clansmen are fierce, my lord, but they are beginning to feel the pressure. They request more men to hold the line. Ned stared at the map. Ned frowned, his brow furrowing deeply. He moved a few small, unpainted wooden markers to the northernmost edge of the map. To the untrained eye, it was simply the chaotic reality of living near the edge of the world. Wildlings raided. It was what they did. But Ned possessed knowledge that spanned beyond the physical realm and the present time. 10 years, Ned thought, the timeline of the coming long night turning rapidly in his mind. In 10 years, Jon Arryn dies. The king rides north, and the dead begin their march in earnest. 10 years to prepare the realm for a war against the dark. But before the dead arrived, the living would come. Ned knew exactly what was causing the sudden, organized spike in wildling raids. It was not mere desperation. It was a symptom of a massive shift in the balance of power beyond the wall. Mance Rayder, the former brother of the Night's Watch, had forsaken his vows. He was out there right now, in the freezing wastes of the Frostfangs and the haunted forest, undertaking a monumental task. He was fighting, bleeding, and singing his way through 100 fiercely independent, bloodthirsty tribes, slowly grinding them into a single, unified host. The increased raids were the displaced pressure of that unification. As Mance gathered his army, the more chaotic, violent clans who refused to kneel to a former crow were being pushed southward, throwing themselves against the Stark defenses in a desperate bid to escape the king beyond the wall. Ned needed the wildlings. He needed them alive, and he needed them south of the wall when the true war began. They were the first line of defense, a massive gathering of free folk that had survived in the ice for 8,000 years. To save them and to use them, Ned needed them unified. He needed a single man who spoke for them all. He needed Mance Rayder to succeed. Let him forge his crown, Ned decided, a cold, hard resolution settling over him. Let him bleed and battle to unite the savages. Let him do the impossible work of bringing the giants and the Vens to heel. And when he is finally the king beyond the wall, then I will cross the wall and I will force him to the negotiating table. But until that day, the North could not appear weak. The wildlings only respected strength. If Ned allowed the vanguard of the free folk to raid the new gift with impunity, Mance would eventually lead his unified hosts south, believing Winterfell was soft. Ned had to show them the teeth of the wolf. Maester Luwin, Ned said, his voice snapping the scholar to attention. Draft a raven to Lord Umber and the mountain clans. Tell them their request for reinforcement is granted. They are to hold their positions and fortify their holdfasts. I shall summon the household guard, my lord? Luwin asked, moving to the writing desk. 100 spears should bolster the line. No, Ned said flatly. The household guard is loud. They march in columns and wear heavy mail. The wildlings will see them coming a mile away and melt back into the trees. Ned turned toward the heavy oak doors of the solar. I am sending the wolf pack. The inner courtyard of the Wolfguard barracks was shielded from the rest of the castle by high stone walls. It was a place of silent, relentless discipline. When Ned Stark walked through the archway, the activity in the yard did not cease, but the atmosphere instantly sharpened. Willem, the captain of the Wolfguard, was currently instructing a squad of young recruits in the art of close-quarters dagger combat. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, disarming a larger boy with a twist of his wrist and a sweep of his leg before pulling him back to his feet. Seeing his lord approach, Willem signaled the recruits to halt and marched sharply across the yard, dropping to one knee. Lord Stark, Willem said. Rise, Willem, Ned commanded. Willem stood, waiting. The young man had grown into a lethal weapon. He was lean, forged entirely of functional muscle, his eyes constantly scanning the edges of the yard. The Wolfguard had swelled to a full 1,000 men under Ned's careful curation, a force of elite, highly trained warriors who answered only to the blood of Winterfell. The free folk are testing the fences of the new gift, Ned stated, skipping any preamble. They are raiding our newly settled lands, stealing sheep, and engaging Lord Umber's patrols. Willem did not react with surprise or outrage. He simply processed the commands. You require a slaughter, my lord? We can sweep the treeline of the haunted forest. They will not hear us approach. I do not require a slaughter, Ned corrected, his gray eyes piercing the captain. I require a message. Ned began to pace the courtyard, his hands clasped behind his back. You will take 250 men of the Wolfguard, Ned ordered. 1/4 of our strength. You will march north and patrol the borders of the new gift. Willem nodded, committing the deployment to memory. It will be done. Your orders are strict, Willem. Listen closely, Ned said, stopping and turning to face him. You are to patrol the edges of the gift. When a wildling raiding party crosses into our lands, you will not meet them in a shield wall like the Umbers. Ned stepped closer, his voice dropping into a low, commanding rumble that carried the subtle weight of the force. You will ambush them. You will disorient them. You will utilize the speed and the strength I have taught you to overwhelm them before they can draw a bronze blade. But you will not slaughter them. Willem's brow furrowed slightly, a rare show of confusion. Not slaughter them, my lord? They are reavers. They are desperate men, Ned corrected. And I need them alive. I want prisoners, Willem. I want men who can speak. I want chieftains, pathfinders, and warriors bound in iron and dragged back to the holds of the gift. Ned's eyes narrowed, visualizing the grand strategy. If they resist to the death, you end them. We are wolves, not lambs. But if you can break their knees, disarm them, and take them alive, you do so. I want the wildlings who escape to run back to the Frostfangs and tell tales not of noisy butchers who blindly kill, but of shadows who strike from the dark, take their strongest warriors, and vanish. We are to build a legend, Lord Stark, Willem deduced, understanding dawning in his eyes. We are to build a reputation, Ned said. I want the free folk to fear the borders of the north, but I also want them to know that Winterfell operates with a cold, terrifying discipline, not mindless savagery. When the time comes to speak with their leaders, I need them to view me as a force of nature, not an executioner. It will be harder to take them alive, my lord, Willem noted pragmatically. It increases the risk to the guard. You are the finest warriors in the 7 kingdoms, Ned replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. You will manage. Prepare your men. You march at first light. For the north. William bowed deeply, turning sharply on his heel to begin the massive preparations. Ned watched him go. The Wolf Guard would secure the border, capturing the vital information needed to track Mance Rayder's slow rise to power. The trap was set. Now he needed the bait. Harma had raided the Neeler lands before, but never this deep. He was a seasoned raider of the Hornfoot clan, his feet black and calloused, indifferent to the freezing snow of the haunted forest. He led a band of 20 fierce free folk, driving a small flock of stolen northern sheep ahead of them. They had slipped past the Umber patrols 3 days ago, filling their bellies with warm meat, and were now making the trek back toward the wall. "These green boys," laughed a raider named Verimer, tossing a stolen iron dagger in his hand. "They build their little stone houses and hide behind their fires. They don't know the woods. Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut," Harma grunted, pulling his furs tighter against the biting wind. "The Umber here is a loud fool, but his axes are sharp. We are miles from any Umber," another wildling boasted. "We own this forest today." The woods around them were thick with ancient pines, the branches heavy with fresh snow. It was silent, save for the bleating of the sheep and the crunch of their boots. Then the silence changed. It wasn't a sound. It was an absence of sound. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Harma stopped, his hand instinctively dropping to the bone axe at his belt. He looked up into the canopy of the pines. "Did you hear?" Verimer started. He never finished the sentence. The forest exploded into motion. There were no war cries, no blaring horns, just a sudden, terrifying blur of dark gray shapes dropping from the branches and rising from the shadows of the underbrush. A figure dropped directly onto Verimer's shoulders, driving him face first into the snow with a sickening crack. Before Harma could even draw his axe, 2 more shadows moved with impossible, fluid speed through the wildling ranks. It was an assault of absolute precision. The attackers didn't swing wild, heavy blows. They used short swords, blunted pommels, and crippling holds. They moved with the synchronized, lethal grace of a pack of hunting wolves. A wildling raised a spear, only to have his wrist shattered by a swift, brutal strike from a shadow that slipped effortlessly past his guard. Another screamed as the back of his knee was kicked out, sending him collapsing into the dirt where a heavy boot immediately pinned his chest. Harma swung his bone axe in a wide, desperate arc. A lean young man with eyes like chipped flint ducked underneath the heavy swing with preternatural speed. He stepped inside Harma's guard, driving the hard pommel of his dagger directly into the wildling's gut. The breath left Harma's lungs in a rush. He staggered backward, gasping, only to have his legs swept out from under him. He hit the freezing ground hard. Before Harma could recover, a heavy knee pinned his shoulder to the earth, and the cold edge of a steel blade rested lightly against his throat. The young man, Willem, stared down at him. There was no rage in his eyes, only cold, terrifying discipline. Harma looked around frantically, his vision swimming. In less than 10 heartbeats, his entire raiding party of 20 hardened free folk had been dismantled. The few who had fought back lay unconscious or groaning with broken limbs. The rest were disarmed, pinned to the snow by men who hadn't even broken a sweat. Not a single attacker had fallen. Not a single word had been shouted. "Who? What are you?" Harma choked out, staring up at the impassive face of his captor. "We are the wolves," Willem said, his voice flat and calm. He signaled to his men with a sharp flick of 2 fingers. "Bind them. Lord Stark wishes to speak with them." Harma felt the heavy iron manacles snap around his wrists. He looked at the silent, deadly warriors moving through the trees, gathering the prisoners. The tales the older raiders told of the soft Neelers in the south were dead. The north had teeth again, and they moved in the shadows. Returning to his solar, Ned found Maester Luwin waiting by the desk, having finished drafting the orders for the Umbers. "There is one more letter to write, Maester," Ned said, taking a seat at the heavy weirwood desk and rubbing his temples. The sheer weight of preparing the realm for the true war was exhausting, even with the unnatural endurance his powers granted him. "To whom, my lord?" Luwin asked, preparing a fresh parchment. "To His Grace King Robert," Ned said. "Dragonglass, the crushed volcanic rock that litters the shores of Dragonstone." "I recall," Luwin said, adjusting his chain. "The glassblowers found it entirely useless for windows. It shatters too easily, and it cannot be melted down in our standard furnaces." Ned stood up, pacing near the hearth. He needed a believable, peculiar excuse to mine thousands of pounds of seemingly worthless volcanic glass without arousing the suspicion of the Crown, the Lannisters, or the Spider in King's Landing. "Draft the letter," Ned instructed, dictating carefully. "Tell the king that the initial shipment of the black stone proved highly pleasing to the eye for northern tastes." Luwin looked highly skeptical but began to write. "Tell him," Ned continued, improvising smoothly, "that Lady Ashera has found the polished black stone to be a striking addition to the new water gardens we are constructing near the hot springs. Tell him it holds the heat of the water remarkably well, creating a steady warmth in the bathing chambers." It was a brilliant lie. It played perfectly into Robert's perception of Ned as a man indulging his beautiful southern wife with harmless luxuries. Furthermore, Ned added, pressing the advantage, "Request his royal permission to establish a permanent, small mining operation on the unspoiled slopes of the Dragonmont. We will provide our own labor and ships. It will cost the Crown nothing, and it will remove the ugly black rocks from his island." Luwin finished writing, sprinkling fine sand over the ink to dry it. "It is an unusual request, Lord Stark, but King Robert rarely denies you anything. I suspect he will find it highly amusing." "That is exactly the reaction I am counting on," Ned said, taking the parchment, reading it over quickly, and pressing the direwolf seal into a pool of hot white wax. "Send it," Ned ordered, handing it back, "and prepare a crew of miners from the Grey Cliffs. Once the King's Raven returns with his approval, I want them sailing for Dragonstone immediately. We need every ounce of that glass we can tear from the earth." 2 weeks later, the reply from King's Landing arrived. Ned sat alone in the Godswood, the blood-red leaves of the heart tree rustling softly above him. The air was freezing, the deep winter finally sinking its teeth into the north, but Ned sat in simple breeches and a linen tunic, a testament to his absolute mastery of his internal energy. He held the crumpled, wine-stained parchment in his hand. He didn't need to read it again. He had already memorized Robert's sprawling, chaotic handwriting. "Ned, you want the black rocks? Take them. Take the whole bloody mountain if it pleases Lady Ashera. If you want to pave your bathtubs with sharp glass, that is your business. Just ensure your next shipment of that northern whiskey includes a few extra crates. The court is entirely intolerable this moon, and Pycelle's voice makes me want to throw myself from the Red Keep. Take the stone, Ned. Just don't ask me to come up there and look at it. Robert." Ned smiled faintly, crumpling the parchment and tossing it into one of the bubbling, sulphurous hot springs nearby. The paper sizzled and dissolved into the scalding water. The Night King was waiting, but as Ned sat in the heart of Winterfell, feeling the strength of his people, the stockpiles of food, and the secret, growing hoard of dragonglass, he did not feel fear. He felt a cold, unyielding anticipation. "I have 7 years," Ned thought, the golden light of the Force flaring brightly within his core, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. 7 years to turn this continent into a weapon. He opened his gray eyes, looking up at the weeping face of the weirwood. "Winter is coming," Ned whispered to the ancient gods. "But so am I." Chapter 72, The Dwarf and the Gargoyles. Casterly Rock was renowned throughout the 7 kingdoms for its immaculate grandeur. Its halls were carved from solid stone, its walls veined with gold, and its courtyards paved with flawless, pale marble. It was a monument to order, wealth, and the unyielding dignity of House Lannister, which was precisely why Tyrion Lannister felt an almost spiritual joy as he watched 20 grown men completely ruin one of its finest training yards. "No, no, no. Stop," Tyrion bellowed, standing atop a high wooden mounting block so he could properly yell at men who were 3 times his height. "You look like a herd of blind cattle slipping on wet cobblestones. Reset the line." Before him lay what used to be the lower tilting yard, a pristine stretch of compacted earth favored by the most elite knights of the Westerlands. Following his father's malicious command to form a team for King Robert's new Northern Games, Tyrion had immediately requisitioned the yard. He had then ordered the castle stewards to divert a steady stream of water from the upper cisterns directly into it for 2 days straight. The result was a glorious, ankle-deep, sucking quagmire of thick brown mud. Lord Tywin had wanted Tyrion to play in the dirt. Tyrion was going to ensure it was the most spectacular dirt in the West. Standing in the center of this swamp were 20 of the largest, thickest-skulled, broadest-shouldered men Tyrion had been able to requisition from the Lannister vanguard. He had specifically asked the Master-at-Arms to send him men whose necks were wider than their heads. The Master-at-Arms had delivered magnificently, Lyle, Tyrion shouted, pointing a small, leather-gloved finger at a man who resembled a shaved bear. When I say brace, I do not mean stick your chest out like a pigeon looking for a mate. I mean drop your weight, bend your knees. While the ox blinked slowly, mud splattered across his heavy brow. He looked at Tyrion with wide, earnest, utterly simple eyes. My mother always said, Lord Tyrion, that a man should stand tall to meet his fate. She said, Lyle, a bent knee is a broken spirit. Tyrion pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling a headache blossoming behind his mismatched eyes. Your mother was a wise woman, Lyle, but she never had to stop 1,000 pounds of angry Northmen from pushing her into a ditch. If you stand perfectly straight, a stiff breeze will knock you over. If you drop your weight, you become a rock. Lyle pondered this heavy concept for a long moment. My mother also said a rock is as a rock does. I will be the rock, Lord Tyrion. Thank you, Lyle. Tyrion sighed heavily. Listen to me, all of you. The men, panting and dripping with brown sludge, turned their attention to the diminutive Lannister. This game, the Shield Wall, is not a tavern brawl, Tyrion lectured, pacing back and forth on his wooden block. It is a puzzle of leverage. The Northmen win because they act like a single, massive entity. You are 20 individual idiots trying to push a wall. You need to become the wall. Tyrion grabbed a long wooden stick and drew a shape in the air. Imagine a lever. If you push at the top of a tall tree, it snaps or uproots easily, yes? Because of the height. He pointed to a massive man named Dake, whose arms were thick as tree trunks, but whose face was completely devoid of deep thought. Dake, do you understand? Dake stared at him, taking the question entirely literally. I would simply cut the tree down with an axe, my lord. Pushing a tree is a waste of effort. It is a metaphor, Dake, Tyrion groaned. A metaphor cannot strike me, Dake stated proudly, crossing his massive arms. My reflexes are far too fast. I would catch the metaphor and break its neck. Tyrion stared at the giant man, entirely unsure if Dake was mocking him, or if the man's brain was simply a solid block of iron. Step forward, Dake, Tyrion commanded, giving up on comparisons. Gregor, step up beside him. Gregor, a man with a jaw that looked like an anvil, took his place. Lock arms, Tyrion commanded. Over the shoulders. Tightly. If I can slide a piece of parchment between you, you aren't close enough. The two behemoths awkwardly threw their massive arms over each other's shoulders, grunting as their heavy leather padding mashed together. Now drop your hips. Lean forward slightly. Imagine you are trying to push Casterly Rock into the sea. The two men bent their knees, their boots sinking deep into the mud. They actually looked quite formidable. Excellent, Tyrion praised, clapping his hands. Now, the rest of you, form up behind them. 3 ranks. Create the wedge. The remaining 18 men scrambled into the mud, shoving each other out of the way as they tried to figure out where a wedge was supposed to go. After 2 minutes of swearing, splashing, and one man accidentally headbutting another, they managed to form a vaguely triangular shape behind Dake and Gregor. Hold that formation, Tyrion yelled. Do not move. I must admit, Tyrion, when father told me he had assigned you to manage a troop of mud wrestlers, I assumed he was speaking figuratively. Tyrion turned around on his block. Standing at the edge of the tilting yard, safely out of reach of the splashing mud, was Ser Jaime Lannister. The newly reinstated heir to Casterly Rock looked resplendent in a finely tailored tunic of crimson silk slashed with gold. In his right hand, however, he held something decidedly not from the Westerlands. It was a heavy, perfectly square bottle of flawless, clear glass, half filled with an amber liquid. Jaime, Tyrion greeted, a genuine smile breaking his frustrated scowl. Welcome to my citadel of higher learning. Please do not step into the yard. You'll ruin your boots. Jaime chuckled, walking over to the wooden fence. I have no intention of joining your swamp, brother, but I thought you might require refreshment. I just purchased this in Lannisport. 10 gold dragons for a single bottle. Tyrion hopped down from his block, carefully stepping on dry stones, and approached the fence. He looked at the square bottle. He recognized the clarity of the glass and the smoky scent wafting from the cork. Northern Fire, Tyrion noted, accepting the bottle. Lord Stark's whiskey. Exactly, Jaime said, his green eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Look at the glass, Tyrion. It is entirely flawless. The merchants are paying a king's ransom for it. The North is draining our vaults with luxury goods, and now we are playing their muddy games in our own courtyards. Tyrion took a sip straight from the heavy bottle. The rich, peaty burn grounded him. Lord Stark is a terrifyingly practical man. Tyrion agreed, handing the bottle back. He conquers our palates while his men conquer the fields. Which brings us back to my current misery. Jaime looked past Tyrion to the 20 massive men standing frozen in the mud. Their arms locked, their faces red with exertion as they held the awkward squatting posture. Why these men? Jaime asked, raising a golden eyebrow. If you wanted sheer, brutal force, why did you not borrow some of Gregor Clegane's hounds? Polliver or the Tickler? They are vicious. Because they are butchers, Tyrion stated flatly. They break ranks to inflict pain. This game does not reward cruelty, Jaime. It rewards cohesion. I need men who will do exactly what I say, exactly when I say it. These men may be as bright as a sack of wet flour, but they are disciplined. They look perfectly miserable, Jaime noted. They are learning angles and leverage, Jaime, Tyrion said proudly. Father thought he was delivering an insult when he gave me this task. Let the dwarf play in the dirt with the other freaks. But he failed to realize that what Eddard Stark invented is a master builder's puzzle. And if there is one thing I excel at, it is dissecting puzzles until they submit. You had best dissect it quickly, Jaime advised, taking a sip of the northern whiskey. The whispers from the south are interesting. The spies say Bryden Tully marches Riverland heavy infantry into the muddy banks of the Red Fork every dawn. And worst of all, our Uncle Kevin received a report from Sunspear. The Red Viper is personally training a team of unarmored spearmen to run information across the shifting desert dunes. Tyrion groaned, rubbing his temples. Doran Martell is sending runners. The Blackfish is preparing for mud. The entire realm is quietly arming for a mock war, and my team thinks a metaphor is a physical object they can strangle. Tyrion turned back to the mud pit. Squad! Tyrion shouted, his voice cracking like a whip. Prepare the wedge. The 20 men grunted in unison, dropping their hips another inch, locking their arms so tightly their biceps bulged against the leather padding. Tyrion looked at Jaime. You see 20 idiots. I see a single 2-ton battering ram. Observe. Tyrion pointed to a massive, heavy wooden barricade that was normally used to train warhorses to charge through obstacles. It was made of thick oak planks, braced with iron, and weighed as much as a small cottage. It was currently sitting at the far end of the mud pit. Target the barricade, Tyrion bellowed to his men. Remember the angle. Do not push up. Drive through. My mama said a rock always rolls downhill. Lyle the ox bellowed earnestly. Just push the wood, Lyle. Tyrion screamed. Forward. The 20 men moved. It was not a chaotic, flailing charge. It was a terrifying, synchronized march. Stomp, stomp, stomp. Their heavy boots hit the mud at the exact same time. The shape of the wedge did not break. It remained perfectly rigid. They hit the heavy oak barricade. The sound was like a thunderclap. The 20 men did not bounce off. They did not stop. Employing the low, rooted stance Tyrion had drilled into them for a week, they hit the wood beneath the center of its weight. The heavy iron braces groaned. The oak planks shrieked in protest. And then, with a violent, cracking explosion, the entire massive barricade was ripped from its moorings in the dirt, lifted slightly into the air, and shoved backward a full 10 yards before collapsing into the mud in a heap of splintered wood. The 20 men stopped, panting heavily, completely uninjured, their formation still relatively intact. Jaime Lannister's jaw actually dropped. He stared at the shattered barricade, then looked down at his diminutive brother. By the 7, Jaime breathed, genuine awe coloring his voice. If you put spikes on their shoulders, they could breach the gates of Riverrun without a ram. Exactly, Tyrion grinned, taking the whiskey bottle back and taking a smug sip. Father told me to build a team for a game. I am building him an infantry vanguard that cannot be broken. The Northmen rely on stubborn endurance. We shall rely on superior leverage and sheer, terrifying mass. Impressive as that is, Jaime said, recovering his composure and crossing his arms. The King's Tournament involves 2 games. Pushing a wall of wood is one thing. What about the other madness? The one with the ball. Tyrion's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of despair. He rubbed his temples vigorously. Ah, yes, the charge, Tyrion muttered, his voice dripping with misery. That is proving to be a slightly more complex knot to untangle. Why? Jaime asked, amused by Tyrion's sudden deflation. It's just running and tossing a leather sack. Because, Jaime, you can teach a gargoyle how to push a wall, Tyrion explained wearily. But teaching a literal-minded gargoyle how to gently toss an object sideways while running at full speed is like trying to teach a fish how to sing. Tyrion turned back to the yard. Break formation, Tyrion ordered the panting men. Bring out the egg. One of the squires scurried over to a dry bench and retrieved a heavy, oval-shaped object made of thick-bore leather, stuffed tightly with sand and wool. He handed it to Dake. Now, Tyrion said, returning to his mounting block, we will practice the lateral pass. Dake, what is the first rule of the egg? Dake held the heavy leather ball up, examining it with intense, literal scrutiny. I must hold the egg. I must not let the egg break. If the egg breaks, the bird inside will die. There is no bird inside the egg, Dake, Tyrion sighed, closing his eyes. It is sand. What is the second rule? Don't throw it forward. Lal the ox supplied helpfully from the side, eager to please. Only sideways or backwards, like a crab running from a boot. Precisely, Tyrion nodded. Now, Dake, you will run toward the far end of the yard. Lal, you will run beside him. Gregor, you will try to tackle Dake. Dake, before Gregor tackles you, you must pass the egg to Lyle. Are we clear? The three massive men nodded slowly. It looked like a very complex piece of strategy was turning in their heads. Now, Tyrion shouted. Dake tucked the leather ball under his arm like a loaf of bread and began to run. He splashed through the mud, a terrifying, unstoppable force of nature. Lyle ran parallel to him, about 5 yards away, waving his hands. I am the crab. Give the egg to the crab, Dake. From the opposite side of the yard, Gregor charged. He roared a battle cry, lowering his shoulder to intercept Dake. Pass it, Dake, Tyrion yelled from the sidelines. Pass the egg. Dake saw Gregor coming. Panic flickered in his eyes. He remembered the rule. Throw it sideways. But he also remembered his own logic. Dake stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his entire body toward Lyle. He wound his arm back as far as it would go, his muscles bulging, and hurled the heavy, sand-filled leather ball with the force of a trebuchet. The ball did not arc gently. It flew like a cannonball. It struck Lyle the ox directly in the center of his forehead with a sickening thwack. Lyle's eyes rolled back in his head. His arms went limp. He fell backward into the mud like a felled tree, completely unconscious. Simultaneously, Gregor, who had been fully committed to his tackling charge and was unable to stop in the slick mud, plowed directly into Dake. The two giants collided with a fleshy crunch, tumbling into the brown water in a tangle of limbs and curses. Tyrion stood on his block, his hands covering his face in absolute despair. From the fence, Jaime burst into a fit of hysterical laughter, clutching his stomach as he watched the three massive men groaning in the mud. Flawless execution, Tyrion, Jaime gasped, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. The enemy will be completely terrified, or they will die of laughter before they even reach the field. Shut up, Jaime, Tyrion grumbled from behind his hands. Tyrion lowered his hands and glared at the carnage in the yard. Dake, Tyrion shouted. Why did you try to decapitate him? Dake sat up in the mud, spitting dirty water, looking genuinely offended by the accusation. I did not aim for his head, my lord. I threw it firmly so the crab would not drop the egg. It is not my fault his head intercepted the pass. It is a pass, not a siege weapon, Tyrion yelled. Someone wake Lyle up before he drowns in the puddle. Gregor hauled himself off Dake, shaking his head to clear the stars. He reached down, grabbed Lyle by the collar of his tunic, and hauled the unconscious man out of the muck, slapping his face lightly until Lyle sputtered and opened his eyes. Mama was right, Lyle mumbled dizzily, staring cross-eyed at the gray sky. Crabs shouldn't try to fly. Tyrion let out a long, heavy breath. He climbed down from the block and walked over to the fence, taking the bottle of Northern Fire back from his brother. As you can see, Tyrion said dryly, the physical conditioning is flawless. The tactical finesse requires translation. Far to the south, in the lush, sun-drenched paradise of Highgarden, the air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and ripe peaches. Lady Olenna Tyrell sat in her private solar, a room of polished pale stone and airy, arched windows. She was not admiring the gardens. She was holding a small, tightly rolled strip of parchment that a trusted handler had just delivered. She read the ciphered words carefully, her sharp eyes narrowing as her brilliant mind pieced together the puzzle. The Blackfish marches Riverland infantry into the bogs at dawn. Prince Doran summons fleet-footed spearmen from the deep dunes. The imp floods the tilting yards of the rock to practice the shield wall. Olenna frowned, lowering the parchment. "What in the seven hells is a shield wall?" she murmured to the empty room. She knew military terms. She knew sieges and cavalry charges. But why were the greatest commanders in Westeros suddenly obsessed with marching men into mud and sand? What secret war was being prepared that the Reach had not been invited to? The heavy oak door to her solar swung open. Lord Mace Tyrell, the Lord of Highgarden, strode into the room. He was holding a silver platter entirely laden with small, lemon-glazed cakes, his cheeks already dusted with powdered sugar. "Good morning, Mother," Mace announced cheerfully, reaching for another cake. "The bakers have finally mastered that northern recipe. The lemon drizzle is extraordinary." Olenna glared at her son. Her patience for his gluttony was extraordinarily low this morning. "Put the cake down, you blooming idiot, and listen to me," Olenna snapped, waving the parchment at him. Mace paused, his hand hovering over the platter, recognizing the tone that usually preceded a verbal flaying. He carefully set the silver tray on a side table and brushed his hands on his tunic. "Is there a problem, Mother? Has Stannis Baratheon complained about our grain shipments again?" "The problem, Mace, is that the entire realm is arming for a conflict, and you are entirely focused on baked goods," Olenna said sharply. She slapped the parchment onto her desk. "My spies report that Tywin Lannister, Doran Martell, and Hoster Tully are actively training specialized teams of men. They are preparing for something called the Shield Wall and the Charge." "What are these things? Are they new siege engines?" Mace blinked, his brow furrowing as he chewed on the words. "The Shield Wall?" Mace asked, his face suddenly lighting up with recognition. "Oh, you mean the mud brawls?" Olenna stared at him, her eyes turning into twin chips of ice. "The mud brawls?" "Yes, Mother?" Mace smiled, oblivious to the danger. "I saw them when I traveled to see Dragonpoint for Lord Benjen's wedding. It is a northern diversion. Men lock their arms together in the dirt and attempt to shove each other backward across a line. And the charge involves running about with a heavy leather ball. King Robert absolutely loved it. He spent half the feast boasting that he would host a grand tourney of these games in King's Landing, commanding every kingdom to compete." Olenna Tyrell sat perfectly still. Her mind, far sharper than any sword, immediately processed the information. She saw past the mud brawl. She saw men locking arms without weapons. She saw endurance training. She saw a king obsessed with a game that was, in reality, a brilliant, disguised infantry drill invented by Eddard Stark. And she realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that the Reach was completely unprepared. "King Robert announced a realm-wide contest of all the kingdoms," Olenna said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "And you did not think to mention this to me?" Mace shifted uncomfortably, finally realizing his error. "Well, Mother, it was just a game, and the feast was so magnificent. The stuffed breads, the roasted roots. You absolute, unfathomable fool," Olenna hissed, standing up from her chair. Mace took a step back. "Mother, you watched the king declare a contest across the entire realm. A contest that the Lannisters, the Tullys, and the Martells have been preparing for over the last year. And you said nothing because you were too distracted by a stuffed bread?" Olenna shrieked, her voice echoing through the solar. "It was a very good bread, Mother," Mace offered weakly, cowering slightly. "It is an infantry drill, Mace," Olenna roared, striking the desk with her cane. "Stark has tricked the realm into hardening their foot soldiers, and because of your monumental stupidity, the Reach, the largest army in Westeros, is going to march into the capital and be humiliated in the dirt by a dwarf and a crannogman." Mace swallowed hard, his face turning pale. I did not realize." "You never realize," Olenna snapped, pointing her cane directly at his chest. "You will go down to the barracks this instant. You will find the largest, strongest, most unyielding men in the vanguard of Highgarden. You will summon Lord Tarly and tell him to march them into the deepest mud pit you can find. And you will not let them out until they can push a mountain." "Why, yes, Mother," Mace stammered, backing toward the door. "Go," Olenna demanded. "And if the Reach is bested in this tournament because you were too busy chewing, I will personally see you fed to the hogs." Mace Tyrell didn't utter another word. He turned on his heel, abandoned his platter of lemon cakes, and fled the solar as fast as his legs could carry him, scrambling down the corridors to find his master at arms. Olenna stood alone in the quiet room, her chest heaving slightly. She looked out the window toward the north. Eddard Stark, Olenna thought, a mixture of profound irritation and reluctant respect settling over her. You quiet, clever wolf. You are making us all dance to your tune. Chapter 73, The Glass Thieves and the Muddy Crown. The free city of Myr was a jewel of commerce and craftsmanship, resting upon the eastern shores of the narrow sea. Its manses were built of pale stone and intricately carved marble, boasting gardens that rivaled the finest courtyards of Highgarden. For centuries, the magisters of Myr had grown incomprehensibly wealthy on three things: fine lace, exquisite tapestries, and the absolute, undisputed mastery of glass. Myrish lenses were prized by every maester in the citadel, and Myrish windows graced the keeps of the wealthiest lords paramount. It was a closely guarded stranglehold on trade, protected by blood oaths, secretive guilds, and the occasional dagger in the dark. But on this particular afternoon, the atmosphere inside the luxurious manse of Magister Ferigo was heavy with a rare and bitter panic. For men sat around a low table of polished mahogany, intricate Myrish carpets muffling the sounds of their servants. They drank sweet plum wine from delicate, thin-stemmed goblets made by their own artisans. But the object sitting in the center of the table was not of their making. It was a heavy, perfectly square bottle of clear glass, half filled with the potent northern spirit known as Winter's Breath. Magister Vario, a stout man with a meticulously oiled and perfumed beard, pointed a thick finger adorned with sapphire rings at the bottle. "Look at it," Vario hissed, his voice trembling with genuine outrage. "Look at the clarity. There are no impurities, no green tint of cheap sand, no clouding. It is as clear as frozen water, yet it is thick enough to bash a man's skull in without shattering. And they are selling it in Bravos for a fraction of what our masters charge for lesser work," added Magister Moro, a thin, sharp-featured man who controlled the city's largest shipping fleet. "The keyholders of the Iron Bank are buying it by the crate. Not just the spirits within, but the glass itself. It is making an agonizing hole in our coffers, my friends. Our glassblowers are reporting cancelled orders from White Harbor, Gulltown, and even King's Landing." Ferigo, the host of the gathering, leaned back in his plush velvet chair and steepled his fingers. "The north of Westeros was a frozen wasteland. They bought our glass because they could not forge their own. Now, this Eddard Stark has somehow conjured a miracle of the forge from the snow. We cannot allow this to continue. A stranglehold is only absolute if it remains unchallenged. Then we must be absolute in our response," Vario said, his eyes narrowing into dark, cruel slits. "If the wolf is biting into our profits, we must cut off the wolf's head. I say we hire the sorrowful men, or pool our gold and petition the faceless men of Bravos. We send an assassin to Winterfell. We kill Lord Stark, and we kill his pups to plunge their region into chaos. Without him, their little revolution collapses." Moro shook his head, a dry, cynical chuckle escaping his lips. "You think like a butcher, Vario, not a merchant," Moro chided, tapping his long fingers on the table. "Assassinating Lord Stark would be a king's ransom to afford, and worse, it would be entirely meaningless to our vaults." Vario bristled, his perfumed beard twitching. "Meaningless? He is the mastermind of this threat." "He was the builder," Ferigo agreed smoothly, seeing Moro's point. "But a keep does not fall down simply because the man who drew the plans dies. Stark did not lock himself in a tower and blow this glass alone. He built massive furnaces. He trained foremen. He taught the methods of making the glass to his small folk." Moro leaned forward, resting his sharp chin on his hands. "Exactly. If we kill Stark, his brother Benjen or his Castellan or his master Smith will simply step into his place. The glass will continue to flow. The damage to our trade will not be halted by a single dagger in the dark. We are facing a grand enterprise, not an individual." The three other magisters fell silent, the terrifying truth of the situation settling over them. They were not fighting a rival merchant. They were fighting a newly awakened kingdom. "Then what is our recourse?" Vario demanded, spreading his hands. "Do we simply lower our prices and bleed our own guilds dry to compete?" "Never," Ferigo said, his voice cold. "We do not yield the market. We take it back." Moro smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. "We must steal the fire from the snow. If the Northmen have discovered a superior, cheaper method of purifying the sand and managing the heat of the kilns, we must possess that knowledge. Thievery and whispers, Vario mused, the anger fading into calculation. Precisely, Moro nodded. We cannot send assassins, but we can send thieves. We must discover the exact composition of their sand. We must map the design of their furnaces. We must learn how they achieve such heat without shattering the crucibles. Ferrigo looked around the table. Winterfell is heavily guarded. The rumors say Lord Stark has established a fanatic guard of young warriors, shadows in gray cloaks who patrol the city and the castle. Strangers asking questions about the glassworks are likely to find themselves hanging from the walls. Then we do not send strangers, Moro said smoothly. We send men who belong there. The North is rich now. They are buying spices, silks, and dyes from Essos. I will embed my best agents into the merchant caravans traveling up the White Knife. Men who know how to look like common laborers, sweepers, or simple traders. They will slip into Winter City. They will find the workers who tend the furnaces. They will ply them with gold, or wine, or whatever vice loosens a Northman's tongue. It will take time, Ferrigo noted. True wealth requires patience, Moro countered. Once we have their secret, we will replicate it here in Myr. With our established trade lanes and superior artisan guilds, we will produce their clear glass at an even lower cost. We will flood the markets of Westeros and Essos with it, and we will drown Lord Stark's new grand enterprise in a sea of our own making. Vario raised his goblet of plum wine, a greedy light returning to his eyes. A fine strategy. We steal the wolf's teeth, and we use them to chew him to the bone. I will handle the infiltration, Moro promised, raising his own glass. My men will sail for White Harbor before the moon turns. The magisters touched their delicate goblets together in a ringing toast to theft and profit. They spent the next hour discussing the finer details of the smuggling routes, the bribes required for the harbor masters, and the shifting politics of the free cities, before finally rising to depart into the warm Myrish evening, utterly confident in their superiority. They did not realize they were attempting to steal a secret guarded by men who could hear a lie before it was spoken. Thousands of miles to the west, the stifling heat of King's Landing had given way to a brisk, wet autumn. Just outside the formidable stone walls of the Red Keep, occupying the large, flat expanse of land near the tourney grounds, a massive expanse of churned earth had been meticulously crafted. King Robert had ordered his master builders to strip away the pristine grass, dig a shallow basin, and flood it with water from the Blackwater Rush until the consistency was an absolute, clinging nightmare of brown sludge. It was the perfect muddy field. On me! Roared a voice that drowned out the cheering of the hundreds of spectators lining the wooden fences. King Robert Baratheon was entirely in his element. He wore no silk or velvet today. He was clad in heavily padded, boiled leather trousers and a thick tunic, both of which were completely indiscernible in color due to the thick layer of wet mud coating him from head to toe. In his massive hands, he clutched a heavy, oval-shaped leather ball stuffed with sand and raw wool. Around him, a chaotic, utterly brutal game of the charge was unfolding. Robert had expressly forbidden steel armor or white cloaks on the field. 15 men of the Kingsguard and elite Crownlands Knights had been forced to strip down and wear the exact same padded, boiled leather tunics and trousers as the king, rendering them nearly indistinguishable from the heavy infantry attempting to block for him. "Take his legs! Get the king by the legs!" shouted Ser Boros Blunt, his face smeared with muck, slipping frantically in his leather boots as he tried to coordinate the defense. "I am a knight of the Kingsguard, not a common pig farmer," Ser Meryn Trant complained bitterly, tugging at the coarse, heavy leather tunic he had been forced to wear in place of his pristine white enamel. He was trying to sidestep a particularly deep puddle of brown sludge like a noblewoman avoiding a rat in an alleyway. "You are a knight of the Kingsguard, Trant, not a maiden at a feast," Robert bellowed with a wild, booming sound of pure joy. "Get in the dirt." He tucked the leather egg tight against his chest and lowered his shoulder. A brave, or perhaps foolish, knight from House Rosby dove directly at Robert's waist. The king didn't even attempt to dodge. He met the man head-on, driving his padded shoulder into the knight's chest with the force of a battering ram. The impact echoed across the field with a loud, wet thud. The Rosby knight was launched backward into the mud, gasping for air, sliding another 5 feet through the slime. Robert kept his legs driving, his heavy boots churning the earth. He was an unstoppable behemoth. 3 more defenders converged on him, wrapping their arms around his massive torso and attempting to drag him down. Robert grunted, his forward charge finally slowing under the sheer weight of 3 armored men hanging off him. Thuras! Robert bellowed over his shoulder. From the absolute chaos of the fray, a figure draped in faded, muddy robes darted forward. Thuras of Myr, the Red Priest, was not a large man, but he moved with a dizzying, unpredictable agility that was only enhanced by the significant amount of wine he had consumed before the match. Thuras held a half-empty wineskin in his left hand, taking a casual swig as he sprinted past a stumbling defender. Robert, feeling his knees beginning to buckle under the weight of the grappling knights, twisted his hips violently. He wrenched his right arm free and executed a powerful, sweeping toss to his side. The heavy leather ball sailed through the air. Thuras dropped his wineskin, threw his hands up, and caught the ball perfectly in stride. He didn't try to plow through the remaining defenders as Robert had. Instead, the Red Priest danced. He spun away from a diving tackle by Ser Marin Trant, who immediately let out a muffled shriek as he landed face-first in a puddle of freezing mud, completely ruining his already filthy leather padding. Thuras feinted sharply to the left to avoid a sweeping grab by a Stokeworth man-at-arms, and sprinted down the open sideline. "Run, you mad priest! Run!" Robert cheered from the bottom of the pile of groaning men. Thuras laughed a high, cackling sound, his bald head gleaming with rain and sweat. He crossed the final lime line and slammed the leather ball against the white wooden post at the far end of the ground. "Point!" shouted the master of the games from the sidelines, waving a red flag. The Stag's score. The crowd of off-duty soldiers, servants, and minor nobles erupted into deafening cheers. Thuras turned around, casually retrieving his fallen wineskin from the mud, wiping the spout, and taking another drink before jogging back toward the center of the field. Robert hauled himself up from the mud, offering a massive hand to pull Ser Boros Blunt to his feet. Boros looked miserable, nursing a bruised shoulder and spitting brown water from his mouth. "A fine attempt, Boros," Robert roared, slapping the Kingsguard heavily on the back. "But you commit too early. You have to wait until I shift my weight before you dive." "Yes, your grace," Boros wheezed, looking ready to collapse. Robert turned to his team, his blue eyes blazing with competitive fire. "Right, enough running. Line up. We practice the wall." The men groaned internally but scrambled to obey. Robert marched to the center of the field, the mud sucking loudly at his boots. He gestured for 14 of the largest, broadest men in his retinue to form up beside him. "Lock arms," Robert commanded, demonstrating the technique he had learned at Sea Dragon Point. He threw his thick arms over the shoulders of the men beside him, weaving their lines together into a single, cohesive unit. The opposing team formed a similar line 20 yards away. "Remember what I told you," Robert barked to his men, pacing slightly before returning to the center of the formation. "If we stand tall, we break. Drop your weight low. Bend your knees. Dig your heels into the mud. We are not 15 men today. We are a stone wall, and a wall does not yield." The men grunted, dropping their weight low, their boots sinking deep into the sludge. "Now," Robert shouted, locking into the center of the line, his face setting into a mask of pure determination. "Push!" The two lines collided. The sound of 30 heavy bodies smashing together was brutal. Robert gritted his teeth, feeling the immense pressure against his shoulders. He didn't just push with his arms. He drove with his legs, his massive thighs burning as he fought for every inch of ground. He was relentless, bellowing orders, keeping the rhythm of his men synchronized. Slowly, inexorably, the King's line began to drive the opposing team backward, their boots sliding helplessly in the mud until they were shoved unceremoniously across the defeat line. "Ha!" Robert cheered, breaking the line and raising his muddy fists to the cheering crowd. "That is how it is done. We will break them all." High above the grounds, standing on a shaded balcony of the Red Keep, Queen Cersei Lannister watched the display with absolute, unadulterated revulsion. She wore a gown of pristine crimson and gold, her hands resting tightly on the carved stone balustrade. Her green eyes were fixed on the massive, mud-covered brute bellowing in the center of the field. "He is a pig," she thought, her lip curling in a sneer of pure disgust. The king of the 7 kingdoms, rolling in the muck with common foot soldiers and drunkards. She despised the North. She despised the savage games Eddard Stark had infected her husband with. Robert had abandoned the elegant justs and chivalric pageantry of the South for this barbaric brawling. It was a gross insult to the dignity of the crown, a mockery of the Lannister wealth that funded it, and most of all, a daily reminder that Robert belonged to the wild, not to her. She turned away, unable to stomach another second of his booming, boorish laughter. She swept back into the cool stone of the keep, calling for her guards to escort her away from the stench of the mud. An hour later, the cheers of the muddy field were replaced by the quiet, scratching sound of a quill on parchment. The hand of the King's Solar in the Tower of the Hand was a sanctuary of order. Heavy tomes of law lined the shelves, and ledgers of the realm's debt sat neatly stacked on the polished oak desk. Jon Arryn sat behind the desk, rubbing his tired eyes. He was reviewing a particularly distressing report from the Master of Coin regarding the vast amounts of gold expended on the sudden construction of the massive mud grounds and the newly commissioned wooden grandstands outside the walls. The heavy oak doors to the Solar burst open with a loud bang. King Robert Baratheon strode into the room. He had not bathed. He had not changed his clothes. He was still clad in his heavily padded leather, dripping thick brown mud onto the priceless Myrish carpets that adorned Jon Arryn's floor. Jon Arryn sighed, laying his quill down and closing his eyes for a brief, suffering moment. "Your Grace, you are tracking the mud into the tower." "Mud washes off, Jon," Robert boomed, entirely ignoring the trail of destruction he was leaving in his wake. He marched directly to the sideboard, grabbed a silver flagon of Arbor Red, and poured himself a brimming goblet. "But glory lasts forever." Robert downed half the goblet in a single gulp, wiping his muddy chin with the back of his equally muddy glove. "The men are ready, Jon," Robert declared, slamming the goblet down on the desk, narrowly missing a stack of ledgers. "Thuras is a madman with the ball, and my heavy infantry can hold a shield wall against a cavalry charge. We are ready." "Ready for what, Robert?" Jon asked patiently, looking at the mud splattered across his pristine desk. "For the Grand Games," Robert shouted, his eyes wide with wild, unchecked enthusiasm. "I have made my decision. The lords are getting restless and fat in their castles. We need a spectacle. We need a contest of strength to remind them who rules this continent." Robert leaned over the desk, planting his muddy hands firmly on the polished wood. "I want ravens sent to every corner of the 7 kingdoms, Jon," Robert commanded. "To Winterfell, to Casterly Rock, to Highgarden, Sunspear, Riverrun, and the Eyrie. Issue a royal decree. In exactly 4 moons' time, I will host the grand royal games of the realm here in King's Landing." Jon Arryn blinked, his statesman's mind immediately running through the nightmare of supplying and housing such a massive gathering. "4 moons, Your Grace? That is barely enough time for the northern lords to travel, let alone train and prepare a proper retinue. They have been training for years," Robert argued dismissively. "Ned invented the damn games. He'll be ready. And Tywin and Mace should be secretly practicing in their own yards. Varys's little birds will confirm it. They just need the formal invitation to stop hiding it." Robert began pacing the room, leaving large muddy footprints near the hearth. "The decree must be absolute, Jon. Every Lord Paramount is required to field a team of their finest 15 men. They must compete in the shield wall and the charge. No lances, no jousting, no pretty armor. I want them in the mud." Jon Arryn steepled his fingers, staring at the king. "A grand tournament of this scale across the entire realm. The housing and feeding of the retinues of all 7 kingdoms. It will be a ruinous cost, Robert. The treasury is still recovering from the Ironborn Rebellion. We cannot afford to host tens of thousands of men for a month-long festival." Robert stopped pacing and waved his hand in a grand, careless gesture. "Then borrow the gold. Go to the Iron Bank. Better yet, send a letter to Tywin Lannister. Tell my dear father-in-law that the crown requires a loan to celebrate the peace he so generously helped secure. He'll pay it just to ensure his golden boys get a chance to show off." "And what is the incentive for the lords to risk their pride in the dirt?" Jon asked, trying to find a reason to delay the madness. "Honor alone will not bring Dorne and the North down the King's Road for a game." "Gold!" Robert roared, his face splitting into a massive, triumphant grin. "We announce a prize so massive it will make even Tywin Lannister's mouth water. 100,000 gold dragons to the team that claims the championship." Jon Arryn's jaw actually dropped. He stared at the king in absolute horrified disbelief. 100,000 dragons? Robert, that is a king's ransom. It is madness. It is motivation, Robert corrected loudly. If I offer them a shiny cup, Mace Tyrell will send his third-tier guardsmen. If I offer them enough gold to build a new castle, he will send his finest champions. I want the absolute best the realm has to offer, Jon. I want to see the Mountain's brother, the Hound, try to break Ned's wolves. I want to see the Red Viper spearmen try to outrun my stags. Robert walked back to the desk, his presence overwhelming the small, orderly space. Draft the letters, Jon, Robert ordered, his tone shifting from enthusiastic boisterousness to the heavy, unyielding command of the Iron Throne. Make it formal. Make it mandatory. The Grand Royal Games begin in 4 moons. Let the realm know that the stag is calling them to the field. Jon Arryn looked at the massive, mud-covered king standing before him. He saw the stubborn, unmovable light in Robert's eyes. He knew that arguing further was as useless as trying to command the tide to stop. Robert had found a new war to fight, one without real casualties, but with all the adrenaline and glory he craved. There was absolutely no stopping him. With a heavy, resigned sigh that seemed to age him another 5 years, Jon Arryn reached for a fresh piece of heavy parchment and his quill. "It will be done, Your Grace," Jon said softly, dipping the quill into the black ink. "I will instruct the maesters to prepare the ravens immediately." "Excellent," Robert cheered, his booming laugh returning as he turned and marched toward the door, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. "I am going to the baths. Then I am going to drink until I forget how much my shoulders ache. See to the ravens, Jon." The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the king, leaving Jon Arryn alone in the quiet solar. The hand of the king looked down at the blank parchment. He shook his head slowly, a profound sense of exhaustion settling deep into his bones. 100,000 dragons for a game in the mud, Jon muttered to himself, bringing the quill to the paper. "May the gods protect the treasury, for the king certainly will not." Jon began to write, sealing the fate of the realm for the coming season. The ravens would fly, and the 7 kingdoms would soon march to war upon a muddy field. Chapter 74, The Ironwood Lance and the Crimson Keep. For turns of the moon had passed since the victorious hosts had departed the damp, shattered rocks of the Iron Islands. Across the 7 kingdoms, those moons had been spent in a feverish state of preparation. King Robert Baratheon's grand decree had reshaped the very nature of southern ambition. Instead of polishing lances and breeding destriers for the tilt, the great houses of Westeros had driven their knights and men-at-arms into the mud. From the high crags of the Eyrie to the golden halls of Casterly Rock, lords had drilled their chosen teams relentlessly. The Grand Royal Games were no longer a mere festival. They had become a bloodless battlefield where regional pride, vast fortunes, and the king's absolute favor were to be won or lost. Every Lord Paramount had answered the call, marching their finest warriors down the King's Road and up the Rose Road, converging on the capital. The banners of the realm were gathering in a display of unity and fierce competition not seen since the days of Aegon the Conqueror. Yet, while the South obsessed over games of mud and leather, Eddard Stark had spent those 4 moons preparing for hell. The Grand Royal Games were merely a convenient diversion for the Lord of Winterfell. His true objective lay far beyond the shores of Westeros, across the narrow sea, past the free cities, and into the boiling, ash-choked nightmare of the Smoking Sea. He was going to the ruins of Valyria. The knowledge locked within Ned's mind, the vast repository of history and lore granted to him by the entity in the void, warned him of the terrifying necessity of this expedition. The threat of the long night was an absolute certainty, a creeping cold that gathered strength beyond the wall. To defeat the White Walkers, the North required weapons capable of shattering their frozen magic. Dragonglass was plentiful, thanks to the mines of Dragonstone, but obsidian was brittle, chipped and broke against heavy armor. They needed Valyrian steel, not just a handful of ancestral swords passed down through noble houses, but the lost secrets of forging it, or at the very least, a hoard of raw, ancient steel pulled directly from the ashes of the freehold. It was a death sentence for any normal man. The seas of Valyria were said to boil, the air was toxic with sulfur and ash, and the creatures that had survived the doom were monstrous aberrations of fire and blood. Therefore, Ned had spent the last 4 moons designing a vessel capable of surviving the impossible. Hidden away in a private, heavily guarded drydock at Sea Dragon Point, the shipwrights of the North had labored day and night under Ned's exacting, relentless supervision. The vessel they berthed was unlike the massive, high-walled carracks that made up the bulk of the new northern fleets. It was not built for carrying heavy cargo or engaging in open naval warfare. It was built purely for speed, swiftness, and survival. Ned named her the Winter's Lance. Her hull was forged entirely from northern ironwood, harvested from the deepest, most ancient groves of the Wolfswood. Ironwood was incredibly dense, notoriously difficult to fell, and ruined the edges of standard axes. Yet, it possessed a natural resilience against fire and a hardness that rivaled iron itself. The ship's design was a marvel of sweeping, predatory lines. She possessed a narrow beam and a razor-sharp prow designed to cut through churning waves with minimal resistance. Her draft was shallow enough to navigate the treacherous, uncharted shallows of the ruined Valyrian coastline, but her keel was heavily weighted with lead to prevent her from capsizing in the violent, unnatural storms of the smoking sea. She bore 3 masts, rigged entirely with triangular lateen sails of dark gray canvas, allowing her to catch the faintest whisper of wind and tack sharply out of danger. She was a ghost ship, built to slip into the graveyard of the Dragon Lords, steal their secrets, and outrun death itself. Ned would not take an army. He would take a single, sharp blade. He had selected 50 of the most elite members of the Wolfguard men who had mastered the physical endurance of the Iron Path. They were utterly loyal and fearless. Benjen Stark had vehemently insisted on joining the expedition. Ned had agreed. Benjen was strong, steady, and possessed an unbreakable bond with the silent currents of the world. But the rest of the pack had remained in the north. Leaving Winterfell had been a heavy, agonizing affair. Ned had kissed Ashera deeply in the Godswood, promising his swift return, leaving her to govern the north alongside Maester Luwin. He had bid farewell to Elia Martell and the disguised Lyanna, knowing their secret was safest behind the granite walls of his ancestral home. He had held Cregan, Rhaenys, Jon, little Sansa, Arya, and the newborn Ricard, committing the weight and warmth of his children to memory. And he had left Arthur Dayne to stand guard over them all. The Sword of the Morning was the ultimate shield, an immovable star remaining in the dark while the wolves sailed south. "Keep the pack safe, Arthur," Ned had commanded before riding out. "Until the oceans dry and the mountains blow away in the wind, Lord Stark." Arthur had sworn, his hand resting upon the pale hilt of dawn. With his family secured, Ned had taken the Winter's Lance down the western coast, rounding the southern tip of the continent, and setting sail for King's Landing to play his part in the King's grand diversion. The stench of King's Landing rolled out over the waters of Blackwater Bay long before the city itself came into full view. It was a suffocating miasma of raw sewage, unwashed bodies, and the smoke of 100,000 hearth fires. To the Northmen, accustomed to the crisp, biting purity of the winter winds, the air tasted foul and heavy. As the Winter's Lance glided smoothly past the imposing, rocky outcropping of the Aegon's High Hill, the sheer scale of the gathering became apparent. The harbor was choked with merchant vessels. Yet, as Ned's sleek, dark ship cut gracefully through the crowded waters, it drew every eye. The ironwood hull seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it, and the gray direwolf snapping from the mainmast sent a ripple of murmurs across the docks. The Winter's Lance was guided smoothly to the Royal Pier, a stretch of pristine stone usually reserved exclusively for the king's own flagships. Standing at the very edge of the pier, waiting patiently with his hands resting upon the pommel of his sword, was a figure of absolute, immaculate dignity. Ser Barristan Selmy, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, wore his bright white enamel armor, a spotless white cloak falling from his broad shoulders. Even in his advanced years, Barristan the Bold radiated a calm, lethal competence. The gangplank was lowered with a heavy wooden thud. Ned Stark, dressed in a tunic of fine gray wool and a cloak lined with black fur, strode down the planks. Beside him walked Benjen, his hand resting casually on the hilt of the Valyrian steel blade, Winter's Bite, the reforged crimson steel taken from the Ironborn, a quiet testament to the battles he had won. Behind them, falling into a perfect, silent formation, came a dozen members of the elite Wolfguard. They wore no bright colors, only the dark gray and black of northern shadows, their faces hidden beneath low hoods. Ser Barristan stepped forward, offering a deep, respectful bow that was reserved only for the highest lords of the realm, or for warriors he considered his equal. "Lord Stark," Barristan greeted, his voice weathered but strong. "Lord Benjen, welcome to King's Landing. His Grace has been eagerly awaiting your arrival. He has threatened to throw the Master of Games into the bay if the tournament is delayed by another day." Ned returned the bow with equal respect. He held no animosity toward the old knight. They had crossed swords in the rushing waters of the Trident, a duel that had ended with Ned sparing Barristan's life. A mutual, unspoken respect existed between them. "Ser Barristan," Ned replied, his gray eyes warm. "It is an honor to see you well. I trust the king has not driven the entire Kingsguard to madness with his impatience." A faint, long-suffering smile touched Barristan's lips. "We endure, my lord. His Grace's enthusiasm for these upcoming games is boundless. The city is bursting at the seams. Every inn is full, every stable is overflowing. The realm has answered his call." "And the lords paramount?" Ned asked, beginning the walk down the long, heavily guarded pier. "Lord Tywin arrived a fortnight ago with a host of massive men from the Westerlands," Barristan reported smoothly, falling into step beside Ned. "Lord Mace Tyrell followed shortly after, bringing a pavilion that is larger than some keeps. Lord Tully and Lord Arryn are already at the Red Keep, managing the burden of feeding this great multitude." "And Dorne?" Benjen inquired, his eyes scanning the colorful flags flapping over the harbor. "Prince Doran could not make the journey, owing to his health," Barristan explained. "He sent his brother, Prince Oberyn, to represent the Sun and Spear. The Red Viper arrived with a team of lightly armored spearmen. They have caused quite a stir in the training yards." Ned nodded. Oberyn's presence was expected. The Viper was eager to test his desert runners against the heavy infantry of the south. They mounted the waiting horses provided by the royal stables and began the ride through the winding, crowded streets of the capital. The Kingsguard cleared a path through the throngs of small folk, who cheered loudly at the sight of the Wolf Lord. As they rode up the steep incline of Aegon's high hill, Ned caught his first glimpse of Robert's grand diversion. Just outside the ancient stone walls of the Red Keep, occupying a massive tract of land that had once been used for jousting lists and royal pavilions, stood a breathtakingly large, newly constructed arena. It was a marvel of earth and timber. High, tiered wooden stands formed a massive oval, capable of seating tens of thousands of spectators. In the center lay the field, a vast, flat expanse of dark, heavy clay that had been intentionally churned and flooded to create a treacherous, exhausting layer of deep mud. It was a monument to raw physical endurance. "He actually built it," Benjen murmured, staring at the sheer scale of the arena. "The king spared no expense," Barristan noted, a hint of disapproval in his knightly tone. "He imported specific clay from the Riverlands to ensure the mud retains the perfect, clinging consistency. He calls it the Field of the Stag." "He is a man who knows what he wants," Ned said dryly. They rode through the heavy bronze gates of the Red Keep, the massive iron portcullis raised high. The inner courtyard was a chaotic swirl of royal guards, squires, and highborn lords conducting the daily business of the realm. The moment Ned dismounted his horse, a booming voice shattered the clamor of the yard. "Finally, the wolves have crept out of the snow." King Robert Baratheon stood at the top of the broad stone steps leading into the great keep. He was dressed in a tunic of rich black velvet, the crowned stag embroidered in heavy gold thread across his massive chest. He looked flush with excitement, holding a silver goblet of wine, looking every inch the conquering king. Robert threw the goblet to a startled servant and descended the steps with a heavy, thundering gait. Ned stepped forward, barely having time to brace himself before Robert enveloped him in a bone-crushing, rib-rattling bear hug. The king smelled of whiskey, roasted meat, and the metallic tang of sweat. "Robert," Ned wheezed, returning the embrace firmly. "You look well. I feel magnificent," Robert roared, pulling back and gripping Ned by the shoulders, shaking him affectionately. "I was beginning to think you had gotten lost at sea, or that the ice had finally frozen you to your high seat. It has been too long, Ned." "Only a few moons, your grace," Ned smiled. Robert turned his fierce, joyous gaze upon Benjen. The king stepped forward and pulled the younger Stark into an equally devastating hug, clapping him hard on the back. "Benjen," Robert boomed, "the slayer of the Bone Hand, the terror of the western shores. I see you brought your new toy." Robert's eyes flicked to the dark pommel of Winter's Bite at Benjen's hip. "A fine blade for a fine warrior." "It serves its purpose, your grace," Benjen replied respectfully, though a proud grin touched his lips. "I hope you and your boys have been eating plenty of raw meat up there in the snow," Robert challenged, leaning back and crossing his massive arms. "Because my team of Crownlanders has been pushing plows through the Kingswood for 3 moons. We are going to drag your wolves through the mud and crush you into the dirt." Benjen did not flinch under the king's booming boast. He squared his shoulders, channeling the quiet, unyielding confidence of his brother. "We prefer to bite the legs out from under the stags, your grace," Ben-Jen retorted smoothly, his gray eyes flashing with competitive fire. "The mud is our home. I will be waiting for you in the center of the field." Robert stared at the young lord for a split second, then threw his head back and unleashed a roar of laughter that echoed off the high stone walls of the keep. "I like this one, Ned," Robert cheered, slapping his thigh. "He has the proper spirit. We shall see who eats the mud." "Hup, we shall see." As Robert's laughter subsided, a quieter, far more restrained presence approached from the steps. Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King, looked older than his years. The stress of managing the realm's finances, dealing with the ambitious lords of the South, and attempting to curb Robert's extravagant spending had carved deep lines into his face. Yet, his blue eyes remained sharp and welcoming. "Lord Stark," Jon Arryn said, extending a hand. Ned clasped the older man's forearm tightly, a deep affection for his former foster father warming his chest. "Jon, it is good to see you. The realm seems to be holding together under your guidance." "Barely," Jon sighed softly, a weary smile touching his lips. "But your arrival brings a much-needed stability to this madness. The lords are eager to see the architect of these games." "They will see me," Ned assured him. Before Jon could speak further, the atmosphere in the courtyard underwent a subtle, chilling shift. The boisterous energy of the king seemed to hit a wall of absolute, freezing decorum. Descending the stone steps with the slow, measured grace of a predatory cat was Queen Cersei Lannister. She was breathtakingly beautiful, a flawless vision of emerald eyes and spun gold hair. She wore a gown of rich, vibrant crimson silk, heavily embroidered with gold lions that caught the sunlight. Her posture was rigidly perfect, projecting an aura of untouchable superiority. In her arms, she held a young child. Prince Joffrey was a toddler, dressed in miniature clothes of gold and black, possessing his mother's golden curls and bright green eyes. He was currently squirming in Cersei's grip, looking thoroughly annoyed by the interruption to his day. Cersei reached the bottom of the steps. She did not smile. She looked at Ned with a cold, evaluating gaze that hid a deep-seated, festering resentment. She despised the influence this northern savage held over her husband. She despised the way Robert looked at Ned with a brotherhood he had never once offered to her. "Lord Stark," Cersei greeted, her voice smooth, melodic, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Welcome back to the capital. We had feared the harsh northern winters had kept you confined to your hall." Ned stepped forward, his face returning to the unreadable, stoic mask. He bowed deeply from the waist, the perfect picture of southern courtesy that he had learned so long ago in the Vale. He took Cersei's extended hand, his lips lightly brushing the heavy gold ring upon her finger, careful not to let his skin touch hers. "Your Grace," Ned said, his voice polite and even. "The North is harsh, but it breeds a resilience that serves us well on long journeys. You look as radiant as the dawn." Cersei offered a thin, aristocratic smile that did not reach her eyes. "You are too kind, Lord Stark. May I present the Crown Prince, Joffrey?" Ned looked at the boy. Joffrey stared back, his small face twisting into a petulant scowl. Even at this young age, Ned could sense the pampered arrogance radiating from the child. He remembered Jaime Lannister's quiet, desperate warning in the tent at Fair Isle. "He is a vicious little monster." "A strong boy, Your Grace," Ned said neutrally, offering the toddler a brief nod. "He bears the pride of the lion." Cersei's eyes narrowed slightly at the omission of the stag, but she accepted the compliment. "He is the future of the realm, Lord Stark, a future forged in strength." Robert, clearly bored by the stifling exchange of pleasantries, clapped his hands together loudly. "Enough of this formal bowing and scraping," Robert commanded, breaking the tension. "Ned has been on a ship for weeks. The man needs solid ground, hot food, and strong wine." Robert turned to one of his hovering stewards. "You, show Lord Stark and his brother to their chambers in the Maiden Vault. Ensure they have hot baths drawn and a fresh change of clothes ready." The king turned back to Ned, his eyes gleaming with the promise of a long, loud evening. "Go get the stench of the sea off you, Ned," Robert instructed, his tone shifting back to the easy familiarity of their youth. "Rest, relax, and stretch your legs. When the sun goes down, we will meet in my private solar. We have catching up to do, and I have a dozen new casks of whiskey that require our immediate attention before the games begin tomorrow." "I will be there, Robert," Ned promised, offering a final, respectful bow to the king and the queen. "And Ben-Jen," Robert yelled after them as they turned to follow the steward. "Tell your wolf guard to eat a hearty meal tonight. Tomorrow, I intend to break them in half." Ben-Jen simply raised a hand over his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the challenge. Ned and Ben-Jen followed the nervous steward through the winding, sunlit corridors of the Red Keep. As they descended a spiraling stone stairwell leading away from the bustling Great Keep and toward the quieter, more secluded guest wings of the Maiden Vault, the shadows in the corridor seemed to deepen. From a recessed alcove, a soft, powdered scent preceded a figure stepping smoothly into their path. Varys the Spider wore robes of rich purple silk, his hands tucked neatly into his wide sleeves. He offered a bow so deep it bordered on mockery, though his soft, plump smile remained perfectly polite. "Lord Stark, Lord Ben-Jen," Varys murmured, his voice like sliding silk, "the capital is overjoyed by your return. We have sung songs of your swift ships and your glorious victories in the west." "Lord Varys," Ned acknowledged, his tone flat and giving nothing away. The Master of Whisperers did not press the greeting. Instead, his dark, calculating eyes drifted past the Stark brothers, lingering on the dozen members of the elite Wolf Guard who followed silently in their wake. The young warriors made no sound on the stone floors, their eyes tracking every blind corner and shadowed archway with cold, professional menace. "You bring a most disciplined retinue this time, my lord," Varys observed, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "They move with a quiet grace rarely seen in men of the north." "They know their duty, Lord Varys," Ned said, stepping past the eunuch, "and they do not speak of it. A rare and precious quality in this city," Varys replied softly, bowing again as they passed. Ned didn't look back, but he felt the spider's gaze following them until they turned the corner. Varys was a creature of secrets, and Ned had just brought a mystery into the very heart of his web. As the heavy oak door of his spacious guest chamber finally closed behind him, shutting out the noise of the capital, Ned Stark let out a long, slow breath. The games of the South were about to begin, but his mind was already fixed on the dark, treacherous waters of the smoking sea that waited for him when the cheering finally stopped. Chapter 75: The Web and the Mockingbird. The Maiden Vault was traditionally a place of sequestered beauty, a comfortable prison designed to keep highborn maidens away from the wandering eyes of the royal court. Today, however, it had been transformed into an armed camp. Eddard Stark stood by the narrow, arched window of his spacious guest quarters, looking out over the sprawling, chaotic sprawl of King's Landing. The city was a festering sore of ambition and squalor, a stark contrast to the clean, ordered lines of his newly built Winter City. The heavy oak door to his chambers opened with a soft, deliberate click. Willem, the captain of the Wolf Guard, stepped inside. He moved with the total silence of a hunting shadow cat. He wore no armor, only his dark gray wool and blackened leather, but his posture was a coiled spring. "The corridors are secured, Lord Stark," Willem reported, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. "Guards are posted at every entrance to our wing. The watches are rotated so no man stands post for more than 4 hours, ensuring sharp eyes." Ned turned away from the window, his expression grave. He walked to the heavy table in the center of the room and poured a single cup of water. "You have done well, Willem," Ned said, taking a slow sip. "But securing the doors is only the first step in a city like this. King's Landing is not Winterfell. The dangers here do not wield axes or battering rams." Willem offered a sharp, attentive nod. He was a creature of the Iron Path, forged by Ned's relentless discipline. He absorbed commands like dry earth drinking rain. "There is a man in this castle," Ned began, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "Varys. They call him the Spider. He is the Master of Whisperers." "We passed a man in purple silks in the corridor," Willem noted. "He smelled of powder and watched us too closely." "That was him," Ned confirmed. "He commands a legion of spies, but they are not grown men, Willem. They are children, servants, scullery maids, the stable boys who brush your horses, the girls who change your linens, the mute children sweeping the hearths. They are his little birds." Ned stepped closer, looking the young captain directly in the eye. "You must proceed as if the very walls of this keep have ears. No battle plans, no discussions of the North, no mention of my family or our true strength are to be spoken of outside this room. When your men speak, they speak of the weather or the food or the mud on their boots. Nothing else." I will relay the command, my lord, Willem said. Our tongues are tied. And there is another matter, Ned continued, his tone turning absolute. The Street of Silk. Willem remained entirely stoic, though a faint flicker of understanding passed through his flinty eyes. The brothels of this city are traps baited with honey, Ned warned. Men go there seeking release, and they speak freely when their blood is hot and their cups are full. The women who work those establishments report to men who would see our house ruined for the price of a silver stag. Ned placed a heavy hand on Willem's shoulder. I am confining the Wolf Guard to the Maiden Vault and the training yards. No man under my banner is to set foot on the Street of Silk. No man is to drink southern wine until he loses his senses. If a man breaks this rule, he does not just face the lash. He faces me. Willem did not flinch. He did not argue the fairness of the decree. We are wolves, Lord Stark, Willem said simply, placing his fist over his heart. We do not feast in the traps of spiders. Your word is iron. See to your men, Captain, Ned commanded. Willem bowed deeply and slipped backward through the door, closing it silently behind him. Ned let out a slow breath. He hated the paranoia of the capital, but he knew exactly what games were played in the shadows of the Red Keep. He would not allow his northern host to be compromised before the tournament even began. An hour later, Ned emerged from his chambers, freshly washed and dressed in a doublet of fine gray wool embroidered with the direwolf in silver thread. Ben-Jen was waiting for him in the corridor, looking thoroughly irritated by the stifling heat of the southern castle. Ben-Jen wore the colors of Sea Dragon Point, the blue and white direwolf Stark against his chest. At his hip hung the dark leather scabbard of Winter's Bite, the Valyrian steel sword he had claimed on Old Wyke. If I spend another hour in these halls, I am going to melt into a puddle, Ben-Jen complained, adjusting the collar of his tunic. How does anyone breathe in this sweltering pit? By taking slow breaths, brother, Ned said, gesturing down the hall. Come, we are expected in the great hall for the welcoming feast. Try to look as though you are not suffocating. They walked together down the winding, torchlit corridors of the Red Keep. The castle was a labyrinth of pale red stone, echoing with the sounds of 1,000 highborn guests preparing for the evening's revelries. As they rounded a wide corner leading toward the Serpentine Steps, they found their path momentarily blocked. A small entourage of Dornish guards, clad in scaled armor and flowing desert silks, were waiting outside an antechamber. Standing at their center was a figure impossible to ignore. Prince Oberyn Martell wore a long surcoat of vibrant orange silk over light leather armor, a golden spear pinned as a brooch over his heart. He was speaking animatedly to one of his guards, but he paused, turning his dark, sharp eyes as the heavy, synchronized footsteps of the Stark brothers approached. A wide, dangerous smile spread across the Red Viper's face. Lord Stark, Lord Ben-Jen, Oberyn called out, stepping away from his guards and sweeping into an elegant, mocking bow. I feared the heat of the south might have melted you entirely before you reached the city. We are harder to melt than that, Prince Oberyn, Ned replied, offering a polite, measured bow in return. It is good to see you well. Ben-Jen offered a respectful nod, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his Valyrian steel blade. Oberyn's eyes flicked to the dark metal of the hilt, an appreciative gleam in his dark eyes. I see the Wolf of the West still carries his bloody prize, Oberyn noted, gesturing to the sword. A fine weapon. It serves its purpose, Ben-Jen said smoothly. Oberyn stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly, the playful banter shifting into genuine inquiry. And how is my sister? Oberyn asked, his gaze locking onto Ned. Elia is flourishing, Ned assured him, his tone warm. And Rhaenys is growing tall and fierce. They are safe, Prince Oberyn. You have my word upon it. And the Lady Ashera? Oberyn asked, a fond smile touching his lips. I received a letter moons ago, stating she was expecting again. The Star of Dorne seems quite content in the snow. She is doing very well, Ned smiled, feeling a pang of longing for his home. She is 7 moons pregnant now. The Maester expects the child before the year turns. 7 moons? Oberyn laughed, shaking his head. You are building an entire army in your own keep, Lord Stark. I offer my deepest congratulations. He turned his dark, assessing gaze to Ben-Jen. And you, Lord of Sea Dragon Point? Did you leave your fearsome she-bear behind to manage the fleet? Or is she simply avoiding the stench of the capital? Ben-Jen chuckled. Daisy has no love for King's Landing, it is true, but she remained behind for a better reason. She is 5 moons pregnant with our first child. Oberyn threw his head back and let out a rich, barking laugh that echoed down the red stone corridor. By the gods! Oberyn cheered, clapping Benjen on the shoulder. Is there something in the water of the north? The two of you leave your pregnant wives freezing in their keeps while you ride south to play games in the mud. What a scandalous pair of husbands you make. The king commands and we follow, Ned said evenly, though his eyes sparkled with amusement. Besides, Ashera is hardly alone. Elia is with her, as is Ser Arthur. And Daisy is surrounded by her mother and sisters at Sea Dragon Point. The wolves and the bears are well guarded. Oberyn nodded slowly, his amusement settling into a quiet, profound respect. He knew the truth of it. Ned Stark had built a fortress of absolute loyalty around his family. It is good, Oberyn said softly. Family must be protected. Speaking of family, Ned pivoted the conversation gently. How fares Prince Doran? Elia told me his health was keeping him confined to the water gardens. Oberyn's face darkened, the easy charm vanishing like smoke. He let out a frustrated sigh, crossing his arms. That's true, Oberyn admitted, his voice tight. My brother's mind is as sharp as a diamond, but his body betrays him. The swelling in his joints, the affliction of the feet and legs. It has grown worse. Some days, the pain is so severe he cannot bear the weight of a silk sheet upon his toes, let alone walk. Ned recognized the description instantly from the vast healing archives of his hidden knowledge. Gout, the disease of kings and rich diets, a corruption of the blood settling in the joints. It is a cruel affliction, Ned said thoughtfully, and one that the maesters often treat with poultices and leeches that do little to cure the root cause. Oberyn scoffed. The maesters are fools playing with mud. They offer him dream wine to sleep, but it does not stop the fire in his blood. Ned looked carefully up and down the corridor to ensure they were not being overheard. He stepped slightly closer to the Dornish prince. I am no maester, Prince Oberyn, Ned said quietly, but I have read ancient texts recovered from the deep vaults of Winterfell, texts detailing the ailments of wealthy men across the narrow sea. Oberyn narrowed his eyes, intrigued. Ned Stark was famous for rebuilding the North with strange, impossible knowledge. If they offered advice, the Viper was wise enough to listen. What do these texts say? Oberyn asked. They say that the fire in the joints is fed by the fire in the belly, Ned explained, translating the ancient healing lore into words the prince would accept. The affliction thrives on a rich, heavy diet. If Prince Doran wishes to see the swelling recede, he must starve the fire. Starve it how? He must cease drinking the heavy, sweet wines of the arbor entirely, Ned instructed firmly. He must stop eating the rich, roasted red meats, the organ meats, and the heavy gravies. He must even cut back on the sweet, sugared fruits of your own orchards. Oberyn frowned deeply. You are telling me my brother must eat like a fasting monk? He is the Prince of Dorne. He is a man whose body cannot process the richness of his plate, Ned corrected calmly. Tell him to adopt a diet of simple grains, clear, fresh water and bitter greens. Lean fish perhaps, but sparingly. If he purges the heavy sugars and rich blood from his daily meals, the swelling will slowly abate. The pain will fade. Oberyn stared at Ned, processing the bizarre, restrictive prescription. It contradicted everything the Citadel taught about feeding a sick man to keep up his strength. Yet, the Northern Lord had built concrete roads and clear glass. A diet of water and bitter greens, Oberyn repeated, turning the concept over in his mind. He gave a slow, decisive nod. It sounds miserable, but Doran is a man of incredible discipline when a goal is set before him. I will send a raven to Sunspear tonight with your counsel, Lord Stark. If your strange northern wisdom restores my brother's legs, Dorne will owe you a debt beyond measure. Let us hope it grants him relief, Ned said politely. Now we should make for the Great Hall. The king is not known for his patience when the roasted boar is waiting. Lead the way, Lord Stark. Oberyn gestured grandly, falling into step beside the Northern brothers as they continued down the corridor. As they approached the massive, towering bronze doors of the Great Hall, the noise of the gathering nobility swelled into a dull, continuous roar. Hundreds of lords, knights, and their retinues were milling about the anteroom, waiting for the formal procession to begin. Standing near the entrance was Jon Arryn. The hand of the king looked up as Ned, Benjen, and Oberyn approached. A weary smile broke through the deep, exhausted lines of his face. "Ned," Jon greeted, extending a hand to clasp his former ward's forearm. "And Lord Benjen, Prince Oberyn. You look as though you are carrying the entire weight of the Red Keep on your shoulders, Jon," Ned observed kindly. "I am carrying the debt of the realm, which is considerably heavier." Jon sighed, shaking his head. The sheer cost of organizing this grand tournament, housing 30,000 men in the surrounding fields, and importing the sheer volume of alcohol the king demands. It is a nightmare to supply and manage. Jon turned slightly, gesturing to a man standing quietly in his shadow. "But I have found some unexpected relief," Jon Arryn said, his tone brightening marginally. "Ned, allow me to introduce a man who has proven remarkably adept at navigating the treacherous waters of Coin. Petyr Baelish." Ned's gaze shifted to the man standing beside the hand. Petyr Baelish was a short, slender man of unassuming build. He wore a finely tailored tunic of dark mockingbird gray, his dark hair carefully styled, a small, sharply pointed beard resting on his chin. He offered a smile that was perfectly polite, yet entirely devoid of genuine warmth. Ned's internal alarms flared violently. The architect of ruin, Ned thought coldly. The man who would gladly burn the realm if he could be king of the ashes. "Lord Stark," Baelish said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr as he executed a flawless, obsequious bow. "It is an absolute honor. The tales of your northern miracles have reached even the deepest counting rooms of the Vale." "Lord Baelish," Ned replied, his face remaining a perfect, unreadable mask of northern ice. He did not extend his hand. Jon Arryn, oblivious to the silent tension, continued his praise. "Petyr managed the customs and revenues in Gulltown during my absence, and he multiplied the port's income tenfold. He has a brilliant mind for ledgers and tariffs. I brought him to the capital just last moon. I am seriously considering advising the king to appoint him as the new master of coin. The current master is completely overwhelmed. I merely found untaxed coin where others saw only tradition, Lord Arryn," Baelish said modestly, looking down at his hands. "The flow of silver is like a river. One simply needs to know where to build the dams and where to dig the canals. A river of silver is a beautiful thing," Ned said, his voice cutting through Baelish's poetic metaphor with blunt, brutal pragmatism. "But a master of coin cannot plug a hole that the king and queen continuously tear open." Jon Arryn grimaced, the truth of the statement hitting him squarely in the chest. "That is the unfortunate reality, Ned. The royal expenditures are vast. The tournaments, the feasts, the queen's demands for new jewelry and retinues. Then you must change the nature of the river," Ned stated, looking at Jon. "You complain of the cost of this tournament, Jon, but you are looking at the ledger backward." Baelish raised a single, curious eyebrow. "Backward, Lord Stark. 30,000 people have flocked to King's Landing for these games," Ned said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had built an empire of industry from the snow. "Merchants from Volantis, armorers from Qohor, horse traders from the Reach. The city is bursting with foreign silver and gold." Ned stepped closer to Jon Arryn, pointing a finger toward the massive doors of the hall. "Do not simply bleed the treasury to feed them," Ned instructed, utilizing the wealth-gathering strategies burned into his mind. "Bleed them. Tax the merchant stalls erected outside the walls. Levy a heavy toll on every foreign good brought into the city limits for the duration of the games. Charge the highborn lords a heavy purse for the shaded, elevated seating around the mud field." Jon Arryn blinked, his tired mind struggling to process the rapid, ruthless extraction of gold from the king's vanity project. "And the betting," Ned continued, his gray eyes locking onto Baelish's sharp gaze. "Thousands of gold dragons will change hands betting on the shield wall and the charge. Do not let that gold vanish into the pockets of back-alley bookmakers. Have the crown claim the sole right to hold the wagers and take a 10th part of every winning purse. Turn the king's folly into the crown's greatest source of coin." Silence fell over the small group. Prince Oberyn let out a low, impressed whistle. "Remind me never to play dice with you, Stark. You would own Sunspear before the night was over." Jon Arryn looked at the parchment in his hands, a sudden, desperate hope lighting his eyes. "Tolls on the stalls, claiming the wagers. Ned, this could offset the entire cost of the construction. It might even turn a profit." "It will turn a massive profit," Ned promised. Petyr Baelish stared at the Lord of Winterfell. The polite, mocking smile had vanished from his face, replaced by a look of intense, guarded calculation. Baelish had built his career on the assumption that highborn lords were honorable, martial fools who understood nothing of coin or leverage. Eddard Stark had just casually outlined a grand scheme of tariffs and tolls that Baelish himself had only begun to formulate. He is not a slow-witted brute, Baelish realized, a cold spike of caution taking root in his chest. The wolf knows how to count. Brilliant suggestions, Lord Stark, Baelish said, his voice losing a fraction of its oily smoothness. I shall begin drafting the taxation decrees for the Hands Review immediately. It is a masterful plan. See that the gold goes to the treasury, Lord Baelish, Ned said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying warning that only the Mockingbird could fully decipher, and not into the pockets of the men collecting it. Baelish bowed deeply, hiding the sudden flash of pure venom in his eyes. Of course, my lord. Come, Jon Arryn said, oblivious to the silent war being waged in front of him. He gestured to the heavy bronze doors. The king is likely already seated. Let us go inside before Robert decides to start the feast without us. The great hall of the Red Keep was a breathtaking display of excessive, overwhelming wealth. Thousands of beeswax candles burned in massive iron chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling, bathing the room in a brilliant, golden light. Long tables stretched down the length of the hall, draped in fine Myrish silks and groaning under the weight of roasted swans, suckling pigs, and towering structures of spun sugar. The banners of the great houses hung proudly from the walls, but the air was thick with the tense, unspoken rivalries of the assembled nobility. The lords of the Reach sat clustered together, whispering behind their wine cups. The Westermen sat rigidly, adorned in heavy gold chains, projecting an aura of untouchable superiority. Ned, Benjen, and Oberyn were shown to their places near the front of the hall, situated close to the raised dais where the high table awaited the royal family. A sudden, sharp blast from the herald's trumpets silenced the low roar of the crowd. All rise! The herald's voice echoed sharply. For his grace, Robert of the House Baratheon, first of his name, and for her grace, Cersei of the House Lannister, Queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, the entire hall stood in unison. The heavy doors behind the high table opened. King Robert Baratheon strode into the hall. He wore a magnificent doublet of heavy black velvet. The crowned stag worked in brilliant gold thread across his massive chest. Yet, he walked with the heavy, irritated gait of a man being led to the executioner's block. He looked completely constrained, a wild beast forced into a gilded cage, his blue eyes sweeping the room with a mixture of boredom and barely concealed rage. Walking beside him, resting her hand lightly on his massive forearm, was Queen Cersei. She was a vision of absolute, flawless perfection. She wore a gown of deep, rich crimson silk that hugged her figure perfectly, dripping with gold embroidery and heavy emeralds. Her golden hair was coiled intricately atop her head, framing a face of breathtaking beauty. But her green eyes were entirely cold. She surveyed the bowing lords of the realm not with gratitude or warmth, but with the sharp, evaluating gaze of a predator inspecting its domain. She radiated an aura of unyielding pride and a deeply hidden, venomous contempt for nearly everyone in the room. As they took their seats at the center of the high table, Ned Stark lowered himself into his own chair. The games were about to begin, but as Ned looked at the king who hated his throne, the queen who hated her husband, and the mockingbird weaving his webs in the shadows, he knew the true battle was already being fought right here in this room.